Friends, thank you very much for joining us. James, very nice to see you again.
Nice to see you, Ian. Yeah, very good.
We haven't done that routine, have we?
We haven't. No.
See you.
Nice to see
Nice.
you.
No, there we go. Okay. Well, it's all about ritual, isn't it?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
we ought to just go through our quick weekly ritual of things people can do. They can
like the videos.
Yeah.
That'd be lovely. Do subscribe to the channel.
Yeah, click down here somewhere down there.
Thank you. Share on social media. That'd be great.
Yeah.
And do comment on on them as well. We'd love to have some.
We always look forward to comments and corrections.
We do indeed.
So
but don't be backward in coming forward.
No, indeed. Now, James, we've got an interesting question of continuity and contrast with last week. So the contrast. Well, tell us where we are. We're which week are we in the lecture?
We're in the sixth Sunday after Trinity 6, and we're in Matthew 13. 1 to 9, and then the lectionary misses out the middle chunk. Have you heard that anywhere before, people?
Oh, yes.
And then verses 18 to 23. So the lectionary is up to its old tricks.
Now, I was going to try and interrupt you before you got into your lectionary rant, but I'll give you full sort of rein to do that in a minute. I think what is interesting in the contrast with last week, the continuity will be in your lectionary rant, but the contrast with last week is that it did feel as though, sorry, folks, if we were a little bit rushed at the end. I mean, last week's reading, it was so dense and so packed with ideas. And we found this before with Matthew, haven't you, sometimes where he actually takes passages, well, the parallel in Mark might be quite extended, and actually Matthew then compresses it. And we had a whole load of absolutely fascinating ideas and sayings. I mean, we didn't even touch on some of them. And one of them was a little saying, but wisdom is known by her deeds. And we didn't explore that. And that's really weird. And then there's also language of the kingdom is taken by violent people, which again we didn't have a chance to explore. So there's all sorts of stuff there. Whereas this week is much more familiar, isn't it?
It is. It's the parable of the sower. I mean, you can't get much more familiar than that with this parable of Jesus. And of course, it's the one parable in amongst all the parables where we get a very fulsome explanation by Jesus of what it actually means, and that's such a rarity. But that's indicative of its importance within the whole sort of canon of parables, isn't it?
Yes.
Which we're no doubt explore in a minute. But
And there's a couple of really interesting things about it as well. One is that, I mean, you say it's a very familiar parable. It is, well, it's fascinating, isn't it? That on the one hand, here's a parable which is included in, I want to say all three Gospels. I mean, the obvious parallels with Mark.
Yeah, I think it is in all three, actually.
Ooh, this is us.
That's a good question. Somebody's going to tell us.
We'll know straight away in a few minutes. When I'll distract you and get you talking, and then I'll have a quick look at my gospel parallels. But no, it is. Of course, it is. I know it is because I actually quote this because Luke says something really interesting at the end of his.
Oh, he does. Yes, you do. You do quote it on the blog. Yeah, actually.
Okay, friends, no need to correct us. It's definitely
no panics.
No. So, but it is interesting, isn't it, that this parallel is in all three of the synoptics, and with explanation, and it is such an engaging story. It's one that's so easy to enact, to engage with.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've been doing over the last few years is visiting people in a local secure mental health unit. So this is for people who've got psychiatric issues but have committed crimes, and therefore the treatment of them is a both containment, as it were, and punishment, but also treatment as well.
Yeah.
One chap I've been visiting for about 15 years has finally actually just this last week got his parole and is now moving out to live independently, which is great.
Right.
But one time I visited there and we looked at this parable, and it was quite funny with both patients and then they're accompanied by staff as well, and we got them to act it out. And what was really fascinating was how easy it was to act out on one hand, but also how engaging it was. People just got really, really, really absorbed into the story. It was really fascinating. And I think again this is the reason why it becomes kind of a favorite Sunday school lesson. Yet again, Jesus illustrates what he's talking about.
Yeah, so memorably.
Incredibly memorable, but also structured.
Yes, which makes it memorable.
It does. We get this progression through the four different, as it were, kinds of soil.
Yeah.
And really just engaging. Very concrete illustrations, very concrete examples. But of course, the really interesting thing is once people acted it out, you then go, well, what next? what does it actually mean? What's the significance?
Quite.
Yeah.
And it's very telling, isn't it? Because I mean, we're told that Jesus didn't teach them anything except in parables.
Mm.
In this parabolic way of teaching. I mean, it's just interesting to reflect on the method of teaching that Jesus brought to people.
Yes.
And it's worth. I think it is really worth thinking about for the church about whether we still take that seriously as an approach to. Because I think a lot of our approaches are to kind of explain the parable, aren't they? Whereas I wonder if there's actually more value in just telling the story and seeing what happens.
Seeing what people think of it. Well, that's interesting. Well, we'll come back to that at the end. I think it's going to elucidate some of the principles here. Should we just turn to our text? So Matthew 13. Now, again, I mean, we do keep mentioning this in Matthew, but again, it comes up that here we are in the third of Matthew's 5 collections of Jesus's teaching, aren't we? So the first collection is in Sermon on the Mount. Second collection we just looked at recently, chapter 10 about mission. The third collection here, parables of the kingdom.
Yeah.
Including in this chapter a number of unique parables to Matthew.
Indeed. Yeah.
Then we get the so-called ecclesiastical chapter in 18, and then we get the eschatology, end of the world stuff in 24 and 25. So,
and Matthew very clearly indicating that this is the next block of teaching by that phrase. He sat. Jesus sits down to teach. So it assumes that.
Now why does he do that?
Sits beside the lake. Yeah.
Why does he sit?
Do
you know?
I don't know. Why does he sit?
Just because in the
that is how rabbis did teach, isn't it? I mean,
yes, I think in the ancient world, people sat to teach because, well, that's actually a question. I just again off the top of my head, it seems to me that it's a sign of leisure. So if you're a working person, you stand because you've got things to do.
Yes.
It's only those who are at leisure who can sit, and therefore teachers. So in fact, our word for school comes from a Greek word meaning leisure.
Okay, right. Okay.
So learning is something you can do if you have leisure, because otherwise you've got to.
You're having to work really hard just to sustain your life.
Harvest a crop or whatever it is. Tend to your goats or whatever. Yeah. So and of course, well, as you know very well, that's why we have the word cathedral.
Yeah, yes, the seat of where the bishop teaches from.
The cathedra. Exactly so.
Yeah.
Although it's funny, isn't it? Because personally, I hate sitting to teach. I always want to stand and move.
No, exactly. I hate it too. Yeah.
It's ironic, isn't it? We reversed it in church that people sit to listen and stand to teach, whereas here, people
stood to listen and the teacher sat. Yeah.
Well, isn't it interesting? If people stood, then we couldn't let them get bored, could we? Because they'd get fidgety.
Yeah, and they'd drift off.
So you'd have to, they'd walk away. So you'd have to make it engaging.
Yeah.
There's a challenge.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be interesting to try that on church and Sunday?
It would. It'd be a fantastic.
Everyone to stand for the sermon, you sit to teach.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
How long would they manage?
Now, a couple of really interesting details here.
Yes.
I just noticed the same day Jesus went out of the house.
Yes. The house.
And
which seems to be Capernaum by the sea.
Yes.
And
we just had the incident where he's been in the house and the crowd's been around him, and his mother and brother and sisters come to because they say he's gone mad and they want to take him away.
Yeah.
It was interesting. So that suggests the location is not far from Capernaum.
Yeah.
Place. He sat beside the sea, and then the great crowds gather around him. Now, again, we did mention this last week, this paradox about response, didn't we? Because although, we mentioned last week that the cities were being judged by Jesus for their failure to respond, and yet Matthew again mentions great crowds.
Great crowds, yeah. And so great that he has to get into a boat and sit there, once again, sits in the boat, and the whole crowd stood on the beach.
Yeah.
So he addresses them from there. And actually, I mean, when I went to the Holy Land and to Sea of Galilee, we sort of did a kind of experiment in a little bay on the to see if that was possible, to speak to a crowd from the sea.
I might have been with you.
Yeah, I think we went different years actually, but I think I've heard you speak about it as well. So to see how the sound carried. Of course, water is actually a good reflector sound. So it's probably in terms of acoustics, probably quite a helpful way of doing it.
Yep. And who did somebody wade into the sea and start speaking?
I think somebody did perhaps wade in. They probably took their
I
shoes
remember very
drops off.
clearly. It was John Goldingay, who was principal at the time. He was wearing his
Okay.
shorts and he took his shoes off and just charged.
Waded in. That is very John. Yeah. So
And,
probably
and,
was
he,
John.
and he had his Bible and he started reading this passage.
Yeah.
We were all. He was in the water.
I think you're right. I think I do remember actually.
Yeah.
It came with
it
us.
does work, doesn't it? And of course, you go there, and it's called Sower's Bay, and the reason it is because that bay happens. I'm sure all the tourist groups stop there.
Yeah.
Bay happens to be very curved, so
sort of amphitheater-like.
It does. It works very well.
Yeah.
And the whole crowd stood on the beach, and interesting, isn't it? Yes. So Matthew's introducing this block of teaching. He told them many things in parables.
Yes. Yeah.
Now we've got a bit of a hang up about this word parable, haven't we? Because there's been lots of debates about what is a parable and how you interpret it, and are there any rules and so on.
We have. There's this. Well, there's quite a sort of. I don't know how long ago it was. Maybe it's 150 years ago. But there's people started saying, well, there's only one meaning to a parable, and everything is a sort of, you can't. And actually, I think nowadays most scholars say it's complete nonsense. That they're multivocal and multivalent. There's they work at different ways. That doesn't mean use a free for all in any way at all. But it does mean they work in multiple ways.
No, it does. And of course, actually, the idea that there's only one point to the parable is actually countered by this parable.
Exactly. Yes.
Because Jesus' description almost makes it sound allegorical.
Yes.
In the sense that each element of the parable, as it were, stands for something.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's not an argument for allegorical interpretation, but it is an insight into what Jesus is doing with this.
Yeah.
And you could argue there is one point, but the one point is that the word gets out, and people respond in different ways. But we'll come back to those points. So
yeah.
A sower went out to sow.
Interesting. He uses that word listen. Before we get to that, he says idu, doesn't he? He says pay attention, notice. Which is a very common Matthean thing, and I suppose is it a little bit like a kind of slightly diminutive form of John's Amen, Amen. It's a sort of take it. I think Steve Walton says it's a take notice moment that Jesus says, and actually, so therefore, this isn't your average parable. This is actually something which is really important. So another reason to elevate the sower above the
other ones. I think, and of course that fits very much with. I mean, although Matthew puts this with other parables, in Mark 4, where he introduces this, it becomes the parable about parables, doesn't it?
It does, absolutely. It is the parable of parables. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And Mark doesn't actually give us the rest of Jesus' teaching. I think in Mark's gospel, this is about the only teaching we get.
Yes, absolutely.
Teaching. A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell amongst the path, the birds came and devoured it, and so on. Now, there's a couple of things to notice here. One is that, of course, sowing in the ancient world, or sowing in this example, isn't seed drilling like we do in modern farms. It is broadcast sowing.
Yes. Yeah.
And you might say, well, why does some seed fall along the path? And the answer is, if you want to know, come to my garden and look at when I've reseeded my lawn. I've ended up with all this grass growing up in my flower beds, which I didn't want.
Quite. Yeah.
And the reason is, unless you've got no wind at all,
you cannot control it.
No, you can't. You can't control it. So, and I think this begins to raise some of the questions about how do we read this in context. And again, one of the big debates about this parable has been, and I guess you, the viewers, will have heard some of these things. So people say, in the ancient world, they didn't do things the way we do. And I think the classic example I've heard, I don't know if you've heard this, is the argument that in the ancient world, in the modern world, we plow up the field and then we sow. In the ancient world, they tended to sow first and then plow. So that's why you wouldn't know what the different kinds of soil were as you sowed the seed. You only discover it later. Have you ever heard that proposition?
I think I have, actually. I think I have heard it.
The problem is with these wonderful insights is that they're not always true.
No, and you would have thought that a farmer would know their soil, actually, wouldn't you? I mean,
I suppose so. Yeah, you get to know if it's your land and you're doing it year by year, you actually know.
You do, yeah.
You get to know what it's like. So.
You've had to work the soil, haven't you?
Yeah. There's another little parallel with my garden, which is that if you want to know what plants are in my garden, I could tell you even if I was miles away from it, because I can picture walking around. Like, as I walk around here, I can see there's the crocosme on the left side, and I can see there's this other one on the right, and then we go past there, and there's a rose growing over. So you do get to know your own land. So
and you know where the claggy bits of soil are, and you know where the good soil is, and
absolutely. So, so some falls on the path, other seed falls on the rocky ground, and again. One of the mistakes here, we think rocky ground means ground with lots of rock in it, but it doesn't. It means ground where there's
soil
underneath. So
yes, exactly.
A thin covering of soil.
So they can't. The seed can grow, but it can't put down roots.
Yep.
Actually, yeah.
And then there's seed which fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Again, just another little reminder of the different world of the first century. For gardeners and for farmers, weeds are the bane of their life.
Yes.
So,
yes. But
you're missing out on this, James, by being a clockmaker rather than a gardener. Really.
Yeah. Well, if I had a decent garden, if the Church of England would provide me with a decent garden, that I would be very happy. I did have a decent garden in my last job, and I was a gardener, but that's all gone to pot now. So I just make do with whatever is presented to me by the Church of England. So, but yeah, no, the thorns and the thistles and so on, and the weeds, I mean, a much higher density in the ancient world, weren't they? I mean, nowadays we've got machinery and pesticides and herbicides to control these things, but that's not the case in the ancient world. So, and of course, there's another parable about the wheat and the tares, aren't there? So, which is really interesting. Another one where you have to have the original context in order to understand the parable properly.
And in fact, this is the parable is later on in this chapter.
Indeed,
chapter 13, verse 24.
Yeah.
Before anybody comments and tells us where it is.
Yeah. Thank you.
we knew already, didn't we, James?
Of course we did. Yeah, I read it the other day actually.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. And then other seed fell on good soil and produced grain, some 30-fold, 100-fold, 60, some 100-fold, 60-fold, some 30. Yeah. On the question of weeds, by the way, on the written blog, there's a link to a rather fun little video, which I know you watched, didn't you?
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah.
It's by a slightly bonkers historian, but it's a really brilliant one because he takes a single still from the film Gladiator.
Yeah.
Where the hero Maximus goes out and he's walking through a field, and he just points out all the things that are completely wrong with the field.
Yes,
because they are a large field with no weeds and short grain. And he said, well, in the ancient world, you had tall grain full of weeds, and all the fields are divided up into small holdings,
boundaries. Yeah,
and you had to, and the road had to have a boundary around it, otherwise the animals going down the road came out and ate all your crops. So that it is. I've also noticed when you see really good historical photos of the English landscape from 300 or 400 years ago, again, it just looks completely different from what we have now.
Yeah.
Just a couple of interesting things to notice here in terms of the structure. Again, Jesus' teaching, there's progression. I think it took me a long time to realize that there is actually a very clear logical progression to these to what happens with these seeds. So the first seed doesn't even get to start, doesn't even put its roots down. The second seed puts its root down but makes no progress at all. The third seed puts its root down, makes some progress, but then actually further down the track gets choked out, and then the fourth seed actually bears fruit. So really interesting sense of progression there. I don't know, is that really obvious? Does everyone notice that when you do it with the Sunday school?
Yeah, I don't have any recollection of noticing that when I was small at a Sunday school, or ever having it been pointed out to me. I think but it is absolutely obvious, isn't it? To anybody sort of reading it now, and And the other thing that you just notice here is which perhaps surprises us, is the yield of the seed that falls into good soil.
Yes,
I mean that's phenomenal, isn't it?
It is.
100-fold, 60, some 30, and I'm not sure whether that direction of travel sort of downwards, as it were, from 100.
Well, it's really odd, isn't it? Because in the other two versions of it, in Luke and Mark,
it's going up, isn't it?
It's going upwards. Yes. And I've got, folks, if you've got an explanation for why Matthew's reversed the order on this, then let us know, because I've not found any explanation of that at all.
Whether he's an optimist and Luke and Mark are pessimists, or the other way around, I don't know. Whether you sort of, I don't know. It'd be really interesting to know what people think about that.
And at the end, Jesus says a phrase which we find in Revelation 2 and 3, but I don't think we find very often or elsewhere in the Gospels. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear.
Yes.
There is no pun there, so because the word for ear for ear is not the same as the word for ear of grain. So
no.
So there's no pun, even though there was one in English. Now we've got this middle section that's cut out by the lectionary.
Yes.
And actually, you were saying there's a connection there, isn't there, with what we were talking about last week?
I think there is, because in chapter 11, where we were thinking about what Jesus and John the Baptist and all of that, there's this discussion that Jesus has, this saying that Jesus has about the Lord hiding things from people, and
you have hidden from the wise and the clever.
Wise, but revealing to the little ones, revealing to the children, the disciples. And here, once again, we have this theme of, listening but not understanding, looking but not perceiving. And so even what you have been taken away. So it's this whole thing, once again, about if there's this sort of initial interest movement towards the kingdom, then more is given. But if there isn't, then even what isn't there is, in a sense, taken away, and that's a really interesting and challenging thing. But we, unfortunately, the lectionary doesn't want us to read that bit. But nevertheless, it's an interesting link, isn't it?
It is, and again, the thing that I think I feel sad about that is that, in my experience, those we speak to, those we preach to, people in our congregations, they're not stupid. They read these things and they have questions about it. And if we avoid preaching about them, we actually do them a disservice by not saying, well, I recognize there's a question here. We might even say, this is tricky, isn't it? I'm not sure that the answer is. Why don't we talk about it a bit more together at some point?
Absolutely. In fact, that is exactly the approach I take with sayings like this in sermons, and it always gets much more engagement than just rolling through stuff which is fairly straightforward, which people have grasped. So I do think we do need to tackle these odd sayings, these challenging sayings, head on if we can.
Well, let's move on to the interpretation, and also just to observe what are the kind of theological themes that are emerging here. There are, again, a couple of really interesting things to notice in the way that Matthew records it. The first thing I was really struck by was in verse 19, when he says, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it. Now, again, that's a difference that Matthew introduces, just to clarify what this word is. So again, it does fit. Even interestingly, that this comes, kind of in the center, the third of the 5 blocks of teaching, and these continually focus on the kingdom, don't they? So the
absolutely,
some of them is about the life of the kingdom. Then we've got about sending out the message of the kingdom with this. Then we've got here understanding the nature of the kingdom. Then we've got the community of the kingdom, and then we've got the consummation of the kingdom. Oh my goodness me, that's a kind of a logical progression there, a series there, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's go on.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say, so the kingdom it's focused on Jesus teaching about the kingdom.
It is, absolutely, and I think this is the only place I can recall where this phrase, "the word of the kingdom," comes. It's interesting that that's not a. It's not a phrase we use in church discourse very much, but it is a very descriptive word, isn't it? It's a very descriptive phrase of what the word of God is. It is the word of the kingdom, and it is therefore to produce the fruit of the kingdom. The
only idea that comes close to it for me is in Luke's summary statements all through Acts, where he talks about the community growing, God added to those who believe. And then he actually talks about the word growing.
Yes.
But what he means by the word growing is really interesting. He actually means people coming to faith. So when people come to faith because of the preaching of the gospel, that itself is the word growing, because it's growing in people's lives. That maybe connects with one thing that was in, again, last week's passage, where Matthew says that, we didn't focus on this, but I did write about it in my blog. Matthew says that the wisdom is shown by her deed, is proved right by her deeds, whereas Luke says wisdom is proved right by her children. Actually, the idea of the word growing and people coming to faith are both seen as different ways of expressing the fruitfulness of the kingdom ministry.
Very interesting. So you do wonder if Luke has this parable in mind when he uses that phrase, don't you?
Yeah, indeed. Interestingly, okay, so we go through the different kinds. The one sown on rocky ground, here's the word immediately, but doesn't put roots down. And there's this focus on endures for a while, but when tribulation comes, this is a really interesting theme. So, because all again through the Gospels and through Acts and in Paul and in Revelation, we're told that you will have tribulation. Jesus says, in this world you will have tribulation, but I've overcome the world. So that's a consistent theme. And then you've got the cares of the world and deceitfulness of riches choking out the world. word for those who are growing up in thorns. And for me, that connects with something we find, which is made, again, it's implicit here, but it's explicit in Luke's version. It's really fascinating that Luke, when he talks about the ones bearing fruit, and again, it's the reverse order, 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold, and he says, with patient endurance, with hupanai. And again, in Revelation 1:9, that's again the word you get coming up. John says, I'm your brother in tribulation, kingdom, and patient endurance in Jesus Christ. So you guys just got to slip in a reference to the book of Revelation there.
Yeah, as you so often do.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, let's just stand back a little bit, and I've drawn out in the written article, I've drawn out what I think, it seems to me, are 3 or perhaps 4 themes here. And what the first one is the grace of God, which is represented graphically by the sower, who broadcasts the seed far and wide without regard, it seems, where it falls, which is a really vivid image, isn't it, of broadcasting.
Absolutely, and it has inspired many missionary movements, and the movement of, to the ends of the earth, really. That everybody, the seed should be sown everywhere, without distinction. And actually, that's a really important idea to hold on to. Actually, I think.
So, do you think we ought to be doing a bit more of our preaching on the street corner?
Well, it depends if you think that's an effective use of broadcasting, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, but the whole point here is it's done without regard to effectiveness.
I know.
Am I needling you there, Rich James? Are you obviously not
no, well, I am not the target of a street preacher, and so I don't know how somebody who would be the target of a street preacher might think about them. So I'm not really, I don't feel qualified to comment. But it doesn't do anything for me, but that doesn't mean it doesn't do anything for somebody else.
And of course, the problem is, I remember very clearly one place I lived, there was always a street preacher, and he was always wearing black, and he always had a big Bible. And there was a really funny thing was that the group from his congregation pretty much support him actually stood 2 meters behind. So it's like they were kind of like there, but a bit reluctant, So
and he probably looked a bit miserable.
Well, absolutely. And the problem with that kind of street preaching for me is it didn't engage people. There wasn't a big crowd standing there. And of course, the challenge here is that Jesus is, I mean, in a sense, the sower who's gone out to sow is initially, the first instance, Jesus himself, isn't he?
Yeah.
And he's sitting and he's preaching to people who have come because his preaching and teaching is so engaging.
Yeah.
And they're standing there. They're not falling asleep. They're not wandering away. They're gripped.
And they're probably gripped by what he's done in terms of healing and miracles as well. So,
that is a bit of a challenge, though, isn't it? Just to sort of broadcast,
It is. No, I think it is. I agree. Absolutely, it is.
I think the second thing I find really striking about this parable is the reality of spiritual opposition, which again is something we kind of often duck in our conversations. So you have, in the interpretation, the birds who come along represent the evil one who snatches away. So on the one hand, you've got the profligate generosity of God and the grace of God in that. And on the other hand, there's clear opposition to the task of the kingdom.
Yes, there's somebody around who really doesn't want the seed to be sown. And we need to be very clear about that, and we need to pray into that, actually. Yeah.
And then the final theme, I think the final major theme is that, and this is I think one of the great ironies about the parable, is that in the end Jesus is teaching about this in order to invite decision and response. So he sets out these 4 alternatives. In a sense, he's leaving it with the audience to say, and here I am sowing the word. What kind of soil are you going to be? The reason why I find that quite entertaining, of course, is that soils don't choose what kind of soil they are.
No, they don't have any. Yeah, they don't have any psyche.
I suppose that's a bit of a guard against treating this as an allegory.
Yeah, absolutely. And parables nearly always break down at some point like that, don't they? When you push them too far. But that doesn't mean that their meaning is not clear. And actually, I find what really challenged me about this is the willingness to persevere. And indeed, particularly for us as preachers, how do we encourage perseverance amongst those to whom we preach? Because perseverance is a really odd thing in our culture. I mean, not many people the only people really known for persevering are sports people.
Yes.
And whenever somebody reaches the top, there is always a story about perseverance. People always say, wow, that took a lot of dedication, didn't it? Because it's unusual. So
fascinating book on sustaining Good Patterns of Living is a book by James Clear called Atomic Habits. I can't remember.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So some really interesting insights there, and to
but help us persevere. Yeah.
Because Jesus' invitation is not just to make a decision. It's about to make a decision to follow a path which we then persevere.
Yes.
I suppose that also leads us to the final observation, which is kind of implicit in this, but it's the hopeful note that each of these accounts of the parable ends on, which is that, and I've just said this on my blog, perhaps the final thing we should note that is, despite some indifferent, shallow, and fruitless responses, in the end, there is a harvest.
There is. Yeah, and it's a big harvest.
Indeed. Friends, thank you so much for joining us. James, thank you for engaging in conversation.
Thank you.
Don't forget to like and to subscribe and to share and to comment.
Yeah.
And maybe on your experiences of speaking about this parable. And look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks very much, James. Cheerio.
Thank you.